Welcome and greetings, career-minded superstars. You are listening to the exclusive Career Coach, your podcast for all things career. And I'm Lisa Edwards, the indispensable career coach for superstars just like you. Now let's dig into this week's topic, shall we? Go from dragging yourself to work each day to finding a job you love. The Career Spring program is for high-achieving and ambitious mid-level professionals like you who are looking for a job that uses your zone of genius, recognizes your value, and pays you what you're worth. If you're ready to learn more, schedule a complimentary consult using the link to my calendar in the show notes. Be sure to follow me on Exclusive Career Coaching on Facebook, Lisa Edwards on LinkedIn, and Lisa.Edwards on Instagram. Greetings. How are you doing? It's the end of September when this comes out. I am ready for some cooler weather. I don't know where you live. Maybe you're already getting it. I live in Florida, as does my guest today, and it's nowhere in sight. So I long. We're going to be talking today about job searching with a chronic physical or mental health condition. And I chose this, and actually my guest suggested this, but I agreed and thought it was a great idea because I get a lot of questions about, there's two fronts, and we're going to be talking about both of them. How do you take care of yourself during a job search if you have one of these conditions? And then there's also the piece about divulging this information. Should you? When should you? And so my guest today, Jane Springer, is going to help with the first part of that, how to take care of yourself. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the kind of laws are, the regulations are around when and if to divulge the information. So Jane, I want to thank you for being a guest again today.
Thank you, Lisa. It's such a pleasure to be here again.
Those of you who have been faithful listeners, Jane has been a guest, I don't know how many times, probably 4 or 5 other times, going way back on the podcast. She's actually a really good friend of mine, lives here in Tallahassee, and she's a life coach. And so, Jane, I know you've introduced yourself on the podcast before, but for those who maybe haven't heard that or new stuff, why don't you tell them about you?
Okay, I'd be glad to. So I'm Jane Springer. I'm a life and wellness coach. I primarily help women in midlife who are pre-diabetic to reverse the prediabetes, lose weight, and regain their health. And on this topic that we're having today, I also have some other chronic conditions that I've had to deal with in my lifetime. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion.
Well, why don't we start with that? Why don't we start with a little bit about your journey and some of the health issues and maybe how that has shown up for you during times of stress, which I think we can all agree a job search is one of those times of stress.
Oh, definitely. Yes. Well, I'll have to go back to a few years. Okay. So when I was in my 30s, I came down with a case of mononucleosis, which is unusual for an adult. Usually it's teenagers, but a very bad case. And I was out of work for 2 months. And when I went back, of course, I was, tired all the time, and they let me come back part-time to begin with. But then I went back full-time, had a young daughter to take care of, and I was working full-time, but it was taking its toll. I had to find accommodations for myself without really divulging to them the long-term aspects of this condition, because the doctors, what happened was 2 years after I got the mono, it came back again, which is another thing that's highly unusual. And at that time, the literature first came out with the possibility that this Epstein-Barr virus, which is the mononucleosis virus, can reoccur and become chronic. And so I might have been the first patient who was identified as that. But at any rate, I knew that this was a condition that there was no cure for, but I knew that I had to be very careful. I had to figure it out how I was going to work with chronic fatigue, with problems with my joints, and recurrences because I had to keep my stress level down because this infection is and still is lurking around for it when I'm stressed out or when I get sick with something else, this can, materialize again. So anyway, the story goes that the second time I got it, when I came back, again, I was out 2 months. I was a state employee at the time and they were very accommodating to me, but at some point, they expected me to be there full time. And so what I would do is because of the fatigue factor, I would take a nap at lunchtime. I would close my door back when, there were offices where you could close your door and I'd put my head down for an hour or, some time during the day I would take a break so I could get some rest because rest was super important. So eventually I was able to work part-time and that really helped because I was able to go home and take a nap in the afternoon after I had worked because I had most of my energy in the morning. So this has been going on with me since way back when, since the 80s. So it really has affected my employment, what jobs I've taken, and my decision to retire, my decision to go back to work after I retired. It has affected many aspects of my job searches and my employment. So I feel like I'm a pretty good example of how to navigate a long-term chronic condition that can affect your job.
So clearly we're not talking about, it takes me a little bit longer to get over a cold or even a cancer diagnosis. That's not a chronic physical and mental health condition or mental health condition. And you've talked about Epstein-Barr. What are some of those other chronic physical and mental, if you know them, conditions that the listeners might be struggling with and may not have thought of them as being, something that could impact their job search?
Right. Okay. So along the lines of the chronic fatigue syndrome is fibromyalgia, where you have pain off and on all the time and it flares up just like chronic fatigue syndrome does. You could also have an autoimmune condition such as lupus or MS, multiple sclerosis, where there are times when you can't work. There are times where you need to take time off. And also, in terms of mental conditions, you could have chronic depression that you are working on, of course, but sometimes makes it hard for you to get up and go to work. The other thing I thought of was if you have a condition such as autism, where you can work, but, there are, special conditions, special types of job environments where you need certain environments in order to work. So it could, there's a range of many possible chronic long-term conditions.
And as I think you guys can pick up on already, some of these are obvious red flags. Let's say your chronic physical condition requires you to be in a wheelchair. That's going to be visible to a prospective employer, and you're going to probably need accommodations both in the interview process and in the job search. Others, specifically mental health, Jane mentioned depression. There's also bipolar disorder. There is borderline personality disorder. And then, of course, autism has such a huge range. You may or may not need accommodations for that. But we're talking about first of all, how to take care of yourself during this process. So based on the experiences that you've had, Jane, what are some of those kinds of things that people need to do and can do to take care of themselves during a job search if they have one of these conditions?
I would say, first of all, that to identify within yourself, what do you need in order to feel good? What do you need? What conditions do you need in order to operate at your most effective and efficient self? Okay, so for me, I knew that I needed rest. And actually, that could go across the board. if you are pushing yourself with any of these conditions, that could, the circumstances could make you run off the rails in terms of your health and well-being. So my first suggestion would be to make sure you're getting enough rest. If you need to take a time out, you take a time out. If you need to go to bed earlier instead of staying up and watching Netflix, then, you need to do that in order to function the next day. So getting enough rest, getting enough sleep, not pushing yourself past the point where you know that you have crossed over the line in terms of your energy level. So that would be my number one for any of these conditions, that when you feel like you need to stop, then you need to stop.
And that's true for not just, we're talking specifically about the job search today, but really ongoing with your condition, whatever it is kind of not denying what your body needs, not pushing past and thinking, I suspect especially women tend to think that it's a noble thing. We've got this big project due. This is after you get the job, of course. Or it could be during an interview. There's this day-long interview, and you know in your heart that you're going to be miserable in the afternoon. Let's say from 3:00 on, you just know that you can't perform. But instead of asking the question, asking for an accommodation, you try to soldier on thinking it's a noble thing, and then you've perhaps cut yourself out of the job because the last thing they're left with is you barely standing up, right? So it has to start with you knowing yourself and being true to what you know your limitations are, and not thinking it's a noble thing to try to push past that.
Right. And, your inclination is to say, I can go a little bit longer. I want to make a good impression. I don't want them to think that I'm, impaired in some way, but generally that can backfire.
Absolutely. So what are some other steps that candidates can take to make sure they're taking care of themselves during a job search?
My number 2 thing would be fuel in terms of food. What are you putting in your body to give you the most energy and your best health? So my suggestion would be eliminate processed foods with sugar, because those not only, raise your blood sugar, and that's kind of my area of expertise, because I did find out at a later time I was pre-diabetic, but raising your blood sugar will give you a quick dopamine hit in your brain, and then your energy will crash. So what you want are, as much as possible, whole foods, not too many, starchy things, but generally whole foods, and hold the processed foods and the sugar, because we want to maintain the most energy as possible, the best circumstances for your brain, but also you want to be able to sleep properly. All those things will work together to overall make you have the best health and be able to put your best foot forward on your job or in your job search.
And it could also be that you have a condition. I tend, as you know, to deal with gastric issues. And so it could be a really good food, but it's not an advised food for my system. And so when you think about a job search, particularly when you get to the point where you're in person, I know that many of the initial rounds are going to be via Zoom or Teams or something. But once you get on site, they may feed you lunch, breakfast, lunch, dinner. I've been on interviews where I've had all 3 meals with people, and it can be real easy to either kind of ignore, that's a food that I'm not going to be in good shape after I eat that food, or, you're limited maybe because of what is available to you at that restaurant or on that spread for breakfast. And so, how how can you keep your mind on, these are the foods that not only are going to fuel, but I'm not going to have a negative reaction from eating certain things. How can you stay on, if you will, on protocol when you're kind of not in control of what's being offered to you?
Well, I've become quite an expert at this because
yes, you have.
Have gone to buffets before at various events. And what you do over time is learn to pick and choose. And that's an experiment. And, you can experiment at home with what foods make you feel good, what foods give you energy, what foods make you sleepy because you want to avoid that. So, I would avoid, like the starchy things like biscuits and bread and, those kinds of things that will raise your blood sugar, but also make you sleepy. So I think it's a matter of learning what foods energize you and what foods bring you down or slow you down. So what I recommend is to experiment. And also there's some of these foods that are inflammatory and which are very detrimental to chronic conditions because you don't want any more inflammation going on in your body, which will exacerbate whatever the issue is. So what you have to do is learn to pick and choose. And when people try and, say, don't you want some dessert? You can always say, gosh, I'm so full right now. Can I take it home with me? Or, I don't think I'm going to have, I'm really full and it was really delicious, but you can be or you can just say, no, thank you, because that works too. And, I've just learned to do what I need to do in order to feel good. You just keep that in mind. I know what keeps my body healthy and operating at 100%. So I think that's my advice right there.
Yeah. So it really gets back to that, not denying what I talked about with your energy levels. The same thing with your foods. If you know that something is going to, let's paint it with a broad brushstroke, make it difficult for you to stay in the room after you eat it, then don't eat it, right? Like don't feel pressured. Don't ignore what you know to be true about yourself. All right. So that's 2. We have 2 steps so far. What's another step candidates can take to take care of themselves during this job search?
Okay. My third recommendation would be movement of some sort. Okay. So when I was recovering and what I have learned over the years and with a chronic condition is to pace myself. So when I was recovering, it would be 5 minutes of walking or 10 minutes of walking, and I would gently work up. But when I got to the point where I knew, and this is experimental, you have to kind of feel your way through it, but know that you've gone as far as you need to go and then stop. But, okay, let's say you're in a wheelchair. There's still things you can do in a wheelchair that's movement. Your arms, some can move your legs, but being, first of all, outside as much as you can. And sometimes it's difficult in some climates, but the sun, just being the fresh air, walking is really the easiest and really most beneficial. You're not pushing yourself too hard, but you are moving. And even if you can't go outside when it's cold, which is what I do, I record shows on TV and I do steps in front of the TV, or I sit in my chair and I move my arms. I mean, but the more you get your circulation going, the more you get outside can really help with depression and fatigue, much as it seems counterintuitive, that it really will help with feeling better. So I would say movement of some sort.
Well, and you can certainly do that during the interview. So most interviews, they're going to give you some periods for, bathroom breaks, check your email, whatever it may be, or the interviewer may need a break to do those same things. And during that time, depending on the setup, the geography that you're dealing with, how about stepping outside and taking a quick walk. I remember going to a conference one time in San Diego. We were at, I think University of San Diego, but I'm not sure what university we were at, but it was beautiful. And I could see the Pacific Ocean. And I was fascinated by how many people, like, we would have a time that we were supposed to write and journal and come up with ideas based on what we had just learned in the group session. And I would immediately head out the door. I would sit on the side. There was a big fountain right outside the meeting room, and it gave me a view of the Pacific Ocean. And I would sit there and do whatever they needed me to do, whatever the assignment was. Mm-hmm. And I got the fresh air. I got a little bit of a walk. I got some sunshine. I got a gorgeous view. I got the breeze, and it really kept me going for the day. So just that little bit of stretching your legs and getting some oxygen going could really help during the interview. And that you don't have to have a chronic condition for that to be a good idea.
Not at all. I mean, I think it's actually a great idea. There have been times where I've been at a conference or something where I would go outside, and even if I didn't know the environment, which sometimes in those conferences you don't, but I would just walk around and around in a circle.
Yeah.
In the parking lot if I needed to, or on the sidewalk, but just to get oxygen going, your blood pumping, a change of scenery, some fresh air, if at all possible. And if that's not possible to go outside, I do it inside. And I mean, they at some point have thought I was a little crazy in my job, because if it's hot in Florida and in summertime. And so I would, within a state office building, I would go up and down the stairs. I would walk through people's, work areas, and they'd say, "Oh, there she goes," but I would make a point during the day to move. It just makes your brain work better.
And I think hopefully what you guys are hearing is that these ways of taking care of yourself, if you have a chronic physical or mental condition, are also the ways that you should take care of yourself if you don't have a chronic. Absolutely. And maybe it might keep you from getting a chronic physical or mental health condition. Mm-hmm. Now, do you have another suggestion for us?
Well, yes, I have. And this is really important. And this is how you speak to yourself. Your own mind talk. Okay. So if you are saying to yourself, for me, I've got chronic fatigue syndrome. I can't function like other people. If you're talking to yourself in those terms, then naturally the result of that, you're gonna have less energy. You're gonna have less energy, and the result could be that how you are perceived by your boss and by the person who's interviewing you, could really make a difference, because people can pick up on your mindset, your energy, the way you present yourself. A better way of looking at it is, to talk about, your assets, like what areas you're strong in, like what I had to do at the beginning when I found out that it was going to be a chronic condition. I just said, I can figure this out. I can figure out how I'm going to take care of my daughter. I was a single parent. I can figure out how to get rest during the day. I can figure this out. And all things are possible. So with a mindset of positivity and encouragement to yourself, and, there'll be times where, you're going to think to yourself, wish I didn't have this. I wish I was normal like other people. And I didn't have to make these special circumstances for myself. But, in those kind of times, there are little, ways you can kind of boost yourself up. You don't have to go to, I'm amazing and healthy and strong, telling yourself that, because your brain really needs to believe it. But you are resourceful. You're smart. You're inventive. There are all kinds of, ways you can speak to yourself that is encouraging versus discouraging.
Oh, that self-talk is so important. And what you make this mean, are you making it mean that you are less than, or are you making it mean that you just have to approach things differently and use, again, that creativity and that intelligence to solve for whatever your condition may be? Any other suggestions before we move on to my next question I'm curious about?
No, I think that
Okay. Perfect. So we got 4, and we're going to go over those again at the end. So let's talk for a minute about some of the red flags that people with chronic physical or mental health conditions should avoid in terms of job duties, conditions. So in other words, as they're looking at positions and maybe in the interview process, maybe the questions they might ask to make sure that the work environment, both physical environment and kind of a mental, social work environment, would facilitate their success.
What I would look for in terms of if you have a chronic condition is, first of all, what are your hours expected to be? And if the red flag might be, well, there might be some overtime. Like you'll be on call some nights from this time, sometime outside of your regular work time. Do you have opportunities for a break or for lunchtime or, what? If they're not being specific about your hours, that could be a red flag for someone with a chronic condition, because those are the kinds of things you need to know walking in, if you decide to take a job.
And I want to be clear that you can ask those questions without divulging that you have a condition if you don't need to. And we're going to talk about when you do and when you don't need to. But you can ask those questions in a neutral way. In fact, I think it was last week's episode where I talked about red flags from employers during the job search process. And one of them is getting those, vague responses to questions or non-responses, and then there's also the difference between what they say and what they do, because they can tell you office hours are 8 to 5, but it's up to you to do a little sleuthing. Does everyone stay? Like, is it, are you going to get side-eyed if you leave at 5:50 because it said 5, but nobody leaves till 8, right? So there's what's written, sort of what the law is, if you will, and then what the practice is. Okay, go. What are some other red flags?
Well, I would pay attention to what kind of questions they're asking you, especially if you're in a wheelchair or, it's obvious that you have some chronic condition. What kind of questions are they asking you? Are they, like making some side references to, what kind of hours can you work? And those kinds of things. Pay attention to, I have found that you just need to pay attention in job interviews to their questions and the way that they are asking the questions to just get a feel. You may have a gut feeling about the way they are asking the questions that may be red flags.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what they can ask and basically beyond, do you need any accommodation? Here's the job responsibilities. Do you need any accommodation? They can't ask you anything else that they don't ask everyone else.
Right.
So they can't ask you, they can't get into your business about your wheelchair or your cane or your, I don't know, maybe there's something physically obvious about, maybe you have a prosthesis. The mental condition's obviously a little bit harder to pick up on unless you've spoken about them. But certainly they can't get in your business. So I think that's a really good one. Any other red flags? I know I have one I want to add if you don't bring it up.
Well, just, one thing I was thinking about was if they say to you, because you're going to ask them, is this an in-person job or can I work from home? Do I need to be there? Well, I need to know specifically because for my condition, going in one day a week, they'll make that be okay. But 5 days a week, 8 hours a day might be a problem for me. And is there a possibility that I could work from home? And if that's the case, how many days can I work from home, or can I do all work from home? I would, ask them directly and specifically, because if they're vague about, well, some days you may need to come in and some days you don't, that doesn't help somebody with a chronic condition, really.
Well, and I'm finding, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, I'm finding that more and more job postings are being specific about the work from home versus in office in a way that they never were prior to COVID, because now the default, if you will, is working from home. And so, that's very attractive to most people. And so it will say, this is an in-office position, or where you get a little bit of vagueness is often, this is a hybrid, and they don't often say what the hybrid looks like. I had a client recently who told me that she went in for a hybrid interview and they told her it was 4.5 days in the office every week and she could work from home on Friday afternoons. Huh? What?
Big help.
Big help. Great. So the red flag that I want to add, and I don't know if you have any more
you go ahead.
Okay. So my red flag has to do with your observing the people that you would be working with in the office, and then beyond that in the company. So this is, of course, assuming that you're in an in-person, and most companies are having an in-person interview before the final hire decision. Are you, especially if you have a physical, so let's just go back to the wheelchair example. Do you see any other people with wheelchairs on? Do you see any accommodations being made? What do you see in terms of the work environment and its ability to be accommodated? For example, just a simple one, and I don't even think this is legal, but if it's a third floor office and there's no elevator, I wouldn't be able to work, and I would be like, nope, no, thank you. So really looking at that environment and seeing, do people like me, that look like me, work here? And does this company seem in practice to be accommodating?
That's a really good one. Yes, I agree with you.
So I often get questions about when and how to divulge information about a physical or mental condition during the job search. And so I want to give you a quote from the Society for Human Resource Management's website. So this is SHRM. This is the main governing body for human resource professionals in the United States. I'm a member of my local chapter here. And so this is actually coming directly from the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. So this is a little bit lengthy, but I think you need to hear it. The Americans with Disabilities Act defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Disabilities outlined by the ADA include, but are in no way limited to, deafness, blindness, non-functioning or missing limbs, cancer, diabetes, asthma, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, arthritis, obsessive compulsive disorder, HIV, and depression. Under the ADA, employers generally can't ask disability-related questions, such as whether the applicant has a disability or what the nature or severity of the disability is, or require applicants to undergo medical examinations until after the applicant has received a conditional job offer. Once a conditional job offer has been made, the employer may ask disability-related questions or require a medical examination, and this is important, so long as all individuals who receive offers for the same job are treated similarly. This is what I talked about a moment ago. That means they must be asked the same questions or required to undergo the same medical examination. Once an individual is employed, disability-related questions and examinations, again, are prohibited except in limited circumstances. Employers may, however, ask applicants whether they can perform the essential duties of a position with or without accommodation. Federal law also permits employers to ask applicants about reasonable accommodations before a conditional offer is made if the employer reasonably believes that the applicant may need an accommodation due to an obvious or voluntarily disclosed disability, or when an applicant has disclosed a need for an accommodation. So that was the quote. And here's what I want to say about this. A best practice for employers is to thoroughly describe the steps the candidate will need to go through for the job interview. And then once they're in the interview, they would want to describe in some detail the duties of the job. Again, we have that physical issue, right? So if you have a physical disability or a mental disability, you want to make sure that you have an in-person interview that is on site so that you can scope out that environment, as I talked about a moment ago, to see you need the information, you need the facts in order to know whether you need to disclose a disability. You could have the same disability and it needs to be disclosed in one set of circumstances for one job and not necessarily in another. So the onus is on the employer to tell you exactly what you're going to do in the interview. Simple, and this has nothing to do with a disability, but I was listening to a conversation at an event on Sunday that Jane actually was at. And the young lady was talking about having worn a brand new pair of shoes, not very comfortable, went to an interview, and she ended up going on sales calls. It was a sales job. She shadowed a sales professional and she walked all day and she was just in horrible pain. So obviously she didn't have a disability. But my point is, had she known, had she maybe asked the question, but the onus really was on the employer. But you can also ask the question, can you tell me about what the interview will entail? So if they don't sort of follow the rules and tell you what the interview process is going to look like, you need to ask the question so that you can determine, number one, how can you accommodate that process? And then number two, do you need to disclose your disability in order to help them accommodate the process? Now, if you don't need accommodations to perform the job, you are under no obligation to voluntarily disclose a disability or a condition. You may choose to, but you don't have to. And my recommendation in that situation is, if you choose and you want it to be before you accept the job offer, you want it to be after a bona fide job offer has been made. The issue becomes when you disclose it too early in the process and they don't have, if you think about the scales of justice, on one side, they've got this potentially heavy thing that they now know about you. And if they don't have on the other side of the scale all kinds of great information about how wonderful an employee you're going to be, it may seem even weightier. This disability may outweigh because they haven't had a chance to learn all the great things about you. Let's get some weight over on that qualification side before we put anything on the scale side about your disability. So, Jane, how about those self-care tips again? I think you had 4 of them for us.
Well, let me give you an example of what you just talked about.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I decided to go back to work after retirement, I was interviewing in person for the job, and I knew that I needed a nap in the afternoon. I was, that's a requirement for me. Okay. So when we were talking, he had described everything that was involved in it, and some of it would be, I'd be able to, work remotely, and, some would be in person. And I decided, and he was offering me the job, and I knew that I could do the job, but I decided at that point, I wanted to be honest about what my capabilities, let's just say, my energy levels were. So I told him that I have a condition where, in the latter part of the day after 2:00, I'm not at my best. So I had this chronic fatigue thing. So, working in the morning, early afternoons would work best for me. And he was fine with it, because in some of these chronic conditions, you can't tell on the outside that someone has a chronic condition. You can't tell if somebody who's has autoimmune or fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue. Some of these, it's sometimes hard to tell. So the employer is not necessarily going to be able to notice that. I could have decided not to tell him because it sounded like the hours would be would accommodate what I needed. But I just felt that if I was going to do this, that I could be honest with him. And I mean, I've worked for him now for 13 years, and they know that I'm not going to be on a call between 2 and 4. I just, or in the early evening, because that's not my energy. And so it did help me to tell them, and I'm upfront with them, if he wants to schedule something for 3 p.m., I'm like, I'm really sorry, but I don't say, that's my nap time. But I do say, can we meet later in the afternoon? And he's very accommodating. So, that was an example of where you decide to do it. But he had offered me the job. So I agree with.
And so much better to do it that way than to take the job, not tell them, and then unknowingly the boss is scheduling, let's say, a staff meeting. Then your condition, let's say it's 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and you're frustrated. Number one, you're probably pissed about it, but you have nobody to blame but yourself. But you're pissed at the boss for doing it, even though he doesn't know. And secondly, you're not showing up as the best version of yourself in that meeting. And so the rest of the staff is like, what's Jane's deal? What's her problem? Right. So again, it's a personal call, but that's a good time to have the conversation is between the time a bona fide job offer has been made and the time you accept that offer. All right. So what are those self-care tips again, real quick?
Okay. So number one, I would say to take the amount of time you need to rest. You're going to determine how much sleep you need in order to function at, the best you can possibly be. If you need to take a rest during the day, if you need to take a break, you need to take it and not just push through thinking, oh, well, they'll think, I'm a hard worker if I just work through this time or lunchtime or whatever. So take the amount of time you need to sleep and to rest, because that's when you're going to be able to operate for them and for yourself at your best possible, condition, your best possible circumstance.
Yes.
Second of all, the food and the fuel that you are giving yourself. If you're eating a bunch of junk food and a bunch of sugar, that is not going to help your own physical condition, and you're not going to operate at your best on the job if you are in a sugar coma after, you've drank a soda and, had whatever it is. But just be aware that, eating whole foods as much as possible and keeping yourself at your top energy level is really going to help you. And number 3 is movement of some sort. Get up, move around, go outside if you possibly can during the day. If you, I would take a break at lunchtime, but the process of moving will not only, help your own condition, but it will also help your brain to, just take a break. And sometimes, as Lisa said, you can get your best ideas when you are sitting outside or you have changed the environment from where you were. And then the 4th thing was your mindset. The way you self-talk is extremely important. The more that you can encourage yourself, the more that you can say, I can do this. I'm capable. I'm smart. I'm strong. it may not be strong physically, but I'm strong internally. I can figure this out. I'm moving forward. I'm the best I can be. That kind of self-talk is going to go way further than if you are saying, poor me, I've got this condition. I feel terrible. I don't think, you just need to help lift yourself up daily is what I would say.
Love those self-care tips, Jane. So how can the listeners find you?
As I said, I'm a life and wellness coach, so they can find me. They can email me at jane@janespringer.com. They can find me on LinkedIn, Jane Peck Springer. They can find me on, what did I say, Facebook? Yeah, Jane Peck Springer or Jane Springer. Either way, because I have an I have a personal page and I have a professional page. So I think those are the easiest ways. You can DM me on any social media, LinkedIn, or just shoot me an email, jane@janespringer.com.
And your website is janespringer.com?
Correct. And I mean, as I said, I do life coaching and wellness coaching. And, I have had multiple chronic conditions over the year. I help, people turn around prediabetes and diabetes and do weight loss and all kinds of things. So, please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to chat with you.
Excellent. Well, Jane, this has been such a good conversation, I think, for so many people. I hope that those of you that have listened that don't have chronic conditions have heard the wisdom as it relates to you as a quote unquote normal employee. I hate that term, but you know what I mean. Someone without those conditions. And if you have them, hopefully you have learned some self-care tips. And also, what does the law say about and what is good practice in terms of divulging that information? So I hope this has been good fodder for you to think about. And I want you to take care. That takes on a new meaning. I say it every week, but it takes a new meaning on today. Take care, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Jane.
You've been listening to The Exclusive Career Coach with Lisa Edwards, CEO of Exclusive Career Coaching. It would be great if you would rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Also, I want to be your career coach, so be sure to ask questions about your career management challenges and job search situation. Until next time.